Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next installment of the Galen Data Medical Device Innovation Series. I'll be your host today. My name is Abbas Talawala, and I'm Chief Technology Officer at Galen Data. Today, we'll be hearing from our own Tim Sandberg, who's the VP of IT Operations, for a conversation on cybersecurity in the cloud, protecting yourself and your end users. We'll learn about key cybersecurity considerations for medical device clouds, what is HITRUST and why has it risen to such importance, and what FDA expects in the cybersecurity plan. But first, a few housekeeping items. A little information on Galen Data. Galen Data provides an FDA-compliant cloud for medical device manufacturers. The Galen Cloud provides a configurable platform for device-to-cloud connectivity that is compliant to the FDA, HIPAA, and CE mark standards. We are ISO 13485 certified, and our product on AWS is HITRUST certified as well. Funded by seasoned medical device professionals, our goal is to make medical device cloud connectivity available to all at a fraction of cost while shaving months of development timeline. Galen Data allows medical device companies to stay medical device companies and not become IT companies. Finally, some quick logistics as we are going through this. If you have any questions, you can type those in the Q&A section. It's available on the sidebar, either to your left or right, depending on your client. We'll either ask those questions to Tim at the end, or if appropriate, I'll bring up those during our conversation. There's also some handouts on the same control panel with more information on Galen Data and a white paper on cloud connectivity. Also a reminder that a copy of this webinar will be sent to you via email. That being said, I'd like to introduce our guest, Tim. Welcome. Let's start with a brief introduction on yourself. I have a slide here about your bio, but tell us more about yourself and how did you end up at Galen Data?
Thanks, Abbas. As Abbas said, my name is Tim Sandberg. I'm the VP of IT Operations for Galen Data. My entire 27-year career has been spent in the medical device field, both for Class 2 and Class 3 medical device companies. Of that, I spent 25 years in IT, and I've been on several product development teams along the way. In my previous company, we took them completely to the cloud in 2014, and also worked on a project with them where we put our device on its own custom cloud. Came to Galen Data through meeting the co-founders, our CEO. I've been working with him as a coworker since 2000, and then worked with the other members of the team on various projects about 8 years ago when I was with my previous company. Came here in 2020 during COVID, and have been here running things ever since. Okay, next slide, please. So I wanted to talk about cybersecurity, some recent news and statistics. So there's been some recent things that have happened. The Change Healthcare ransomware attack. So Change Healthcare, they've had 2 cyber attacks. The most recent one, where stolen employee credentials were used for remote access. And because the systems that they had were not segregated properly, it allowed those attackers to move sideways into other systems and completely wreak havoc within there. Even though Change Healthcare paid the $22 million ransom, they actually set themselves up for further attempts at extortion, since the data was also stolen and offered up for sale on the dark web. In a statement the company issued just on June 20th, they are in the process of notifying affected individuals, and with the scope of their operations, it's expected that this could affect up to 1/3 of all Americans. It's a pretty significant breach there. CentraMed is a San Antonio-based healthcare provider that had a data breach that leaked 400,000 patients' PHI in May. The same organization had a data breach in 2023 that exposed 350,000 patient records as well. And then, as all of you may have heard, the XZ backdoor, which was a vulnerability in SSH, and it's kind of an insidious attack. A developer, he insinuated himself into this developer library project, and over the course of years introduced this backdoor and allowed it to propagate within the open source community. And it was only really found through the attentiveness of a developer who noticed a lag that he wasn't expecting, a lag in the millisecond range, and he discovered this vulnerability. It just goes to show even open source, which is touted as being highly secure because so many people are developing against it, it can be just as vulnerable if people aren't attentive and vet the developers working on any project that could have upstream implications, like this library that was incorporated into SSH. So just some recent news there. Some statistics. So there have been 733 security breaches so far in 2023, which was a 20% increase over 2022. And this is most likely underreported data due to many breaches not even being detected for a long time. When a breach happens, you have loss of data, you have loss of system availability, hacked devices. Typically at risk is name and address information, SSN, any biometric data or diagnostic data, what we consider PHI or PII under HIPAA. And these breaches can, so far, have affected 66.7 million patient records in the US alone.
Let me kind of inject a quick question here. So security, I mean, we see these numbers, these are insane numbers, 100% year over year impact on patient records. Mm-hmm. But maybe explain, I mean, cybersecurity is not a healthcare problem, it's a IT problem, and that exists other places. But healthcare is a special sort of nature of the data, right? Maybe elaborate some of that, why it's even more problematic in the healthcare industry and why we are not prepared as an industry very well for these kind of things.
Right. So, you know, it's especially insidious in the healthcare industry because typically healthcare entities collect things like I have here, like your social security information. So it's important for insurance to have that information in order, you know, for the reimbursement process to happen. So the information is much more sensitive and harder to protect. You know, as an industry as a whole, you know, if a website is broken into that you have your credit card information, they have that stored. Yes, it is damaging to have your credit card stolen, but it's fairly easy to remediate in terms of, you know, your credit card company can just reissue a new card with a new number and, you know, reimburse you for any stolen money that's come out of your account. Whereas this type of information can be used for identity theft, and that's typically how it's used. And that identity theft, you know, can lead to much bigger problems. Accounts being opened in your name for credit, people's other, you know, any other online transaction where they have to create an identity, you're completely at risk there. And that's why it's much more insidious. The healthcare industry tends to be very conservative, and we've lagged behind in terms of regulations around that and protections. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about a little bit later here in this webinar, is why we've chosen a particular security framework to protect us around that. The FDA and the you know, MDR has gone a long way to start addressing a lot of this. You know, with the recent FDA guidance that was issued it was issued in 2022, became effective in 2023, has gone a long way to try to address those things. But we're still constantly trying to catch up. You know, threat actors are also constantly finding new things. And as one of the things that's kind of important, that XZ backdoor, as I mentioned, that was years in process, creating that backdoor and getting it distributed. These are the types of resources that like state actors typically do. You're seeing governments that perhaps are getting into this as well. So you know, your information that's part of healthcare is much more sensitive than just your stuff that you may have put on some random web store where you bought some socks or something like that. Okay, next slide, please. So just some cybersecurity and privacy regulations. There's a large myriad of these laws, like HIPAA and HITECH here in the US, the GDPR in the EU. Each state, it seems like these days, are creating their own privacy laws as well, the CCPA, which is the California Privacy Act, Massachusetts Data Protection Law. Those are kind of the two most prominent ones, COPPA, Cloud Act, the PIPE Act in Canada, and then we have several security standards as well, ISO 27001, 27010, 27018, NIST, and then HITRUST. HITRUST isn't really a standard so much as a framework, but it's the focus of our talk here today. So next slide, please. Okay, so managing cybersecurity. Starting a formal cybersecurity program can be very daunting. It often becomes analysis paralysis. And this is where a lot of companies, whether you're in healthcare or just any other IT company, this is where you kind of get stuck because there is so much to address. Just finding a starting point it's daunting. It's a huge hurdle to get past. You know, what am I trying to be compliant to? Where do I start finding the requirements to even do any of this? And as I mentioned before, there's just a myriad of standards and laws. You know, in the US, it's not just federal laws, it's individual state laws and cybersecurity programs. As an example, not just HIPAA, but if you want to do business with the federal government, you have to be FedRAMP certified. And a lot of states are going to their own programs. Texas has one called TexRAMP. It's kind of in the same vein as FedRAMP, where you certify to a certain set of requirements that the governments, state governments or federal government has put out there. And that all takes time to make sure that you're addressing all those requirements and moving the ball forward. So any independently developed cybersecurity program that addresses all these is very difficult to create from scratch. You can have hundreds and hundreds of requirements, and harmonizing and maintaining those requirements itself, not just meeting those requirements, but just maintaining what they are and making sure they're staying up to date is itself a massive task. And that is why we chose to leverage HITRUST for cybersecurity certification. Next slide, please. So HITRUST, what is it? So HITRUST is a risk-based cybersecurity framework that uses a number of different standards and harmonizes them into a consistent set of requirements. By creating this consistent framework, it's easy to identify and remediate any deficiencies that are applicable to all the covered standards. There are different types of certifications, with the differences really being the maturity of meeting the assessment requirements and the length of validity for certification. So right now they have 3 different certifications. This is rather recent. They are up from just 2 previously. So E1 is the kind of the basic one. That's their foundational cybersecurity, and that's just a 1-year certification. So if you want to just meet the basic requirements, you could do an E1 and you get 1 year of validity of that. I1 adds some more requirements on top of that, and it's also a 1-year validated assessment. And then R2 is the full expanded requirements, and it's a 2-year validated assessment. So R2 is what Galen data is certified to, and it's a rather extensive program. Next slide, please.
Before we go there,
yeah.
Can you give some kind of idea on the scope difference between like an I1 and R2? How many more requirements? Is it double the requirements, 40% more, 60% more? Some idea to the listeners on the amount of work if you want to go between I1 and R2.
So like I said, E1 is just the foundational. So in terms of overall scope, our first R2 assessment had 324 requirements. E1 would be about a subset of about 100 of those requirements. So just the basics. Are you, wireless security as an example? Do you have wireless access points, and do you have them locked down with a password? To get onto a wireless network, they're just not open and free for anybody. Just kind of simple requirements like that, but a foundation that you can build on for the next level. I1 takes that to the next step and expands that, so it'd be probably about I think about 180, 190 requirements. So a little bit more detail. Are you scanning for rogue access points? Taking the wireless example, are you maintaining that that type of wireless security? There are And then R2 is the full thing. So essentially everything you need to be doing to have a complete cybersecurity 360-degree view of your systems.
Thank you.
So just some background on HITRUST itself. It was initially developed in 1996 to meet HIPAA compliance. It has since evolved to cover a broad range of standards. These standards include the NIST 800-53 standard, also called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, or CSF, HIPAA, GDPR, ISO 27001, 27002, SOC 2, there's FedRAMP, there's also the state requirements as well, so the Massachusetts, the CCPA, all of those can be included in your assessment. You don't have to start off with all of these. NIST 800-53 is the basic standard, and then you can add these as necessary to the scope of your assessment if you want. It's the amount of requirements you have to meet is determined by what standards that you want to be applicable in your environment. Galen is certified to all these in our HITRUST certification except for FedRAMP. Next slide, please. So our journey to certification, we started the HITRUST process back in March of 2021. And the initial project scope was limited to just US operations. We didn't have any customers in the EU yet, and that was a requirement by HITRUST before we could gain EU certification for our operations. So we started with just the US, and that included 324 requirement statements across all 19 domains. HITRUST itself breaks down the assessment into 19 domains, and each of those domains have a variable number of requirements that you have to meet. So that's how that broke down. Having an ISO certified QMS greatly accelerated our project. This was really important because a big part of the the HITRUST process is creating documentation, both policies, procedures, work instructions, all of that, and having them in a system that controls them and allows them to be reviewed, trained on, and ultimately signed off. Also, part of the HITRUST process requires the engagement of a third-party assessor. That third-party assessor must be certified by HITRUST, so that's part of that third-party assessor's their own process is gaining those certifications, and their job is to provide guidance and independently review documentation and evidence. We used a company called EC First, who was excellent. I can't emphasize enough that selecting the right third-party assessor is critical to the success of your project. A knowledgeable, responsive team is key, and I can't express that more about EC First. They're excellent people to work with. So in accordance with the certification process itself, we broke the project into two major parts. So the creation and upload / review of documentation and evidence gathering. So part one, next slide, please, of that is the creation of those documentation. And so we start first by scoping the assessment. So this is where you say how many records you're storing, how many locations you have, where your data centers are located, and then you picking the standards that you want to be certified against. Once you do that, then the system, the HITRUST My CSF portal, generates the number of requirements that you have to meet. And then you start creating the policies and procedures that conform and address the requirement statements. So once it generates those requirements, you can perform a gap analysis of the current state of your systems against those, against your newly created policies and procedures, and then updating and implementing the tools and processes to address the gaps. So the Galen Cloud itself was developed as if it were a Class 3 medical device. It's not actually a medical device, but we developed as if it was. So we have DHFs, and we already had the policies and procedures in place for creating that documentation. So those were all applicable, and that was a huge leap ahead for us to just be able to use that existing documentation and cite that. But operationally, there existed about a 5% gap that needed to be addressed. So once we created all that documentation and addressed the gaps, then personnel were trained and those processes were monitored for compliance. We then upload, a part of all this process is uploading that documentation into the MyCSF portal for assessor review, and then our third-party assessor went and reviewed every single document, made sure that each addressed the requirements as necessary, and was in conformance with what was expected there. That MyCSF tool is your best friend through this whole process. It really does help streamline and make sure you're doing everything correctly. It makes it easy to cite the HITRUST requirements, essentially creating a trace matrix between the requirements and your documentation. Next slide, please. So HITRUST itself requires that processes and procedures be implemented for at least 90 days before they can be tested. And by tested, they mean that you're creating evidence that this is what you said you're going to do. Are you actually doing it? So that process of testing involves evidence in the form of documents, logs, screenshots, and I can tell you that everything has a timestamp. When creating screenshots, having your system clock in view is probably the most critical thing. I know that sounds kind of silly, but it's really important to be able to trace to that time when things were created, because you only have a 2-week window that's defined by what's called your QA reservation date. So when you start the process, you pick a date in the future that your assessment object is going to be submitted to HITRUST Quality Assurance for their review and ultimate approval of your entire assessment object. So you work backwards from that date, and so your evidence period is 2 weeks with a 30-day window prior to your QA date. And so you only have 2 weeks to create that evidence, and that is critical. 324 requirements is a lot of evidence on the order of gigabytes from us, logs, screenshots, everything. So we were able to achieve that 2-week window, submit to QA, and we achieved our initial certification in March of 2022.
What time? I mean, we achieved in March 2022, and I know we started in 2021, but can you quantify the amount of effort we put into the initial certification, given that we had a large amount of stuff already taken care of, just because operationally we were doing all the right things,
right.
And we had some of it, bolstered by having a QMS and having a ISO 1345 certification. But in rough estimate, what was that time in terms of effort? Kind of went into it, and then if we didn't have, or if somebody doesn't have that kind of base, what can they expect in terms of effort to be able to achieve that certification?
So the first certification we estimated was about 220 man hours of time to do all of that. We had to create all that documentation, but we had a large base to draw from, and that sped it up. Also having the ISO certified quality management system, being able to just do training directly through that system greatly sped that up. If we didn't have those things, if you didn't have all those procedures already in place and you're trying to do HITRUST for your product, I would estimate it's probably easily 400 hours worth of work. I know that, having those things in place, the ISO, just doing ISO alone is a massive undertaking, and getting that certification is huge. And then the product documentation, having all of those QMS procedures, that was a lot too. I mean, Abbas, you created most of that documentation. How long did that take you initially?
A few months. So it is a lot of effort, and roughly, I mean, I know there's a cost of people, cost of labor, but not counting that, just external cost. How much does it roughly cost externally, minus the payroll? to kind of get a certification like this, a rough order of magnitude?
I believe the first time around it was around $70,000 for our initial certification, and then I'll talk about this here in a few minutes, but there's continued compliance. So we, as I mentioned before, we have an R2 certification. So that's a 2-year certification. You, as a company, you get certification, and then you have an interim assessment in the middle, and that has a cost associated with it, both between what you pay HITRUST and what you pay a third-party assessor, and then obviously your internal time that you're spending on it, and then the following year you do a full-blown assessment all over again. So you're spending this money, a significant amount of money, every 2 years to just maintain your entire certification.
Cool.
Okay. Next slide. So as I just mentioned, the interim process must be performed. The interim process is not super onerous. Your third-party assessor picks a random requirement from each of the 19 domains, and you have to provide evidence for that random requirement. You also have to show that you've reviewed and done any updates to your documentation. So whereas the initial was hundreds of hours, the interim assessment was, I think, probably about a total of 20 to 25 hours, if I had to estimate that. So not onerous, but and fairly easy to get through. Now, the second year full assessment, this gives you the opportunity to incorporate new products, new data center locations. In our case, we incorporated our EU operations since we were operating in the EU with paying customers. And that increased our requirements significantly. So, going through the second time around, it was still about 250 hours is what I estimated to be, because of all the updates that we had to do around that, performing the gap analysis for the new requirements, addressing those and making sure everything was up to date, implementing that. So HITRUST themselves is continually updating the framework. So as standards evolves and new laws are passed, the MyCSF tool makes it very easy to see where the gaps are in your current implementation versus an updated framework. And then the framework itself is very flexible, and then it only dictates the what you need to do, not the how. So implementing new services or tools for conformance is just a matter of updating your internal procedures. So in the case of implementing the EU operations, it was just making sure that well, first of all, we already had the procedures around, creating this new data center, spinning it up and all of that. And we had all the evidence for that already. But in order to stay GDPR compliant, there was other things that we had to make sure that were already addressed, and they were, but just had to provide the proof of that. So, once you get going, it's still a lot of work, but it is, it helps you maintain that compliance rather than, just being stuck and not knowing how to move things forward that way. Okay. Next slide. So the end result. So HITRUST is recognized and respected within the healthcare industry, often vastly accelerates an organization's ability to get their products approved within hospitals and clinics. Regulatory bodies are taking increasing notice of these certifications as a signal of product maturity when cloud components are incorporated into medical devices. And then just like any product or development or application development, cybersecurity should be a continuous improvement cycle. So the process of attaining and maintaining that certification enforces that cycle. And continuous education is really critical to that. Are you, and this is part of HITRUST, they have a whole domain on education. Are you educating your users? Are you, a great example with us, since we're a target, we handle healthcare data. We receive a lot of phishing threats. Our CFO sends me 3 or 4 emails daily of new phishing attempts that he has received. CFOs are huge targets, CTOs, CEOs, and it's not hard to figure out who these people are with LinkedIn and everything like that. And companies have standard email addresses, usually first name and last name, something like that. So we receive those all the time. And then when something new is received, It's a matter of, hey, taking screenshots of it and sending it out to the rest of your end users and saying, hey, look, this is a new phishing attempt. Remember, look for these key elements. Is the from address really legitimate? What about this header? And um, email, a lot of email services, like Office 365, have gone a long way to address that as well. They say, hey, you don't ever receive email from this person. There'll be a big banner now in your email, stuff like that. So it's important that you're not only educating yourself from a cybersecurity standpoint, for me operationally, but a boss as the CTO in doing product development. It's important for him and his team to stay educated. And then everybody else within the organization, making sure that they're trained to recognize these types of threats, and you're documenting that you're training them. It's not just enough to send an email. It's, well, did you guys understand what that email meant and what you're looking for? So yearly training on all of this is critical as well. So and HITRUST itself is not a means to an end. You just don't attain it and stop there. It doesn't necessarily force you, but it encourages you to keep these things going, a continuous improvement program, because you're always making sure that I'm documenting what I'm doing and I'm doing what I'm documenting, and education's a big part of that.
Yeah, I mean, cybersecurity, as we always say, is a shared responsibility. There's just no way to say done one place or HITRUST came and certified and that's all great. It's a continuous process because threat evolves, and the bad guys don't sit there and do nothing. They evolve. We see new ways. You mentioned the supply chain issue, developers going and or getting access to source code and updating, and there's just a lot of different ways that the attack is evolving, and so you gotta keep up, and that's part of what I think HITRUST does for us. It allows us to keep up by introducing new frameworks or updates to new standards. All right, so let's talk a little bit. We talk a lot about HITRUST, but maybe we talk a little bit on what the regulatory bodies, specifically FDA or MDR certification, what do they expect in terms of cybersecurity? I know we have a slide here, and we'll talk through this.
Yeah. So, the FDA passed a guidance in 2022. It became effective in 2023, really scrutinizing medical device cybersecurity. And this, the guidance that became effective in 2023 really kind of harmonized their guidance to what MDR was trying to accomplish. MDR was much more strict, and now the FDA is bringing that in line. The 2023 guidance specifically calls out AI and cloud-based services, and then advocates for a secure product development framework. And this kind of goes hand in hand with just product development in and of itself. Product development is not one and done. It's a continuous development cycle. A company in this day and age, you can't make a product and just say, well, that's it. We're never going to improve on it. This is the way it's always going to be, unless you're making Band-Aids. But even the Band-Aid corporation is coming out with new and better Band-Aids all the time, and a Band-Aid is a Class 1 medical device. So under the secure product development framework, the foundation of that is a risk-based approach, and that guidance specifically references the NIST CSF. And as I mentioned, that's core to HITRUST. That 800-53 standard is the core part of HITRUST, and the FDA is now bringing that in harmony with this SPDF framework that they're talking about. And then emphasis on security controls. The FDA has specifically in that guidance called out, authentication, authorization, cryptography, code data execution integrity, confidentiality, event detection and logging, resilience and recovery, and then importantly, updating and patching your devices in the field. The Swintooth vulnerability that was discovered back in 2018 is a great example of this. There was a vulnerability discovered in a specific Bluetooth stack, and it left a lot of devices open because it was so widely incorporated into a lot of microcontrollers. And the big question was, well, how are you as a company going to fix that if it's affecting you? And this has really kind of driven the whole idea of, if you're connected to the cloud, you should need to be able to update your device through that same cloud. And so the FDA has really put an emphasis on that. And just recently in March, they issued a draft guidance off of the 2023 one, and it goes a few steps further. They advocating transparency and disclosure of cybersecurity risks through coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So bringing that in line with the CVE process. If you're not familiar with that, CVE is a national organization, or not international organization, that is essentially a bank of all the disclosed vulnerabilities in software. So kind of the idea around that is, this becomes public information, and it becomes public after the issue is hopefully fixed. But that's kind of the idea, making everybody aware and being transparent about it. And then again, more emphasis on being able to update software and firmware. This can't be conveyed enough. It's, the boss said, and I mentioned, it's cybersecurity is not static. There are bad actors constantly finding new ways of exploiting hardware and software, and you need to be able to address that in an agile fashion. You find a cybersecurity issue in your software or your product, you got to do a risk analysis and figure out, all right, what's the worst case scenario here? Can this kill somebody? Is it going to cause serious injury? Or is it just going to cause loss of therapy? I mean, all of those are very serious in the FDA's eyes. If it's causing loss of therapy, is that life-threatening as well? So, you doing all of this it's all risk-based, and going back to HITRUST and how all of that works, you have to be constantly assessing the risk of these vulnerabilities and then addressing them in the timely and appropriate fashion. And then whereas the 2023 guidance was suggested the use of SBOMs, the 2024 is really said, nope, you need to use SBOMs, and you need to keep track of what you're using and any vulnerabilities that are found in that, and then your plan to address those as well.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize a couple of things that the FDA did with this guidance. One is it's expanded the scope of cybersecurity. Before the 2023 guidance, it was connected devices that were included in the cybersecurity guidance kind of scope. They changed that to what they call cyber device. A cyber device, the way they define it, is any device, any medical device that meets the definition of device that has software in it. So even if it's not connected to a network, not connected to the cloud, the FDA is saying that you still have cybersecurity vulnerabilities, which is accurate because you have software, and that they want you to kind of go through the process that they laid out. And they also have refusal to accept. So anything that you submit now that doesn't have the cybersecurity documentation that they need, essentially they will not even look at your pre-market application. And that's something very similar the MDR is doing as well, is making it a mandatory thing. Obviously, it's a risk-based approach. So depending on your risk, you will have your scope of activities would be more or less, but you can't skip the whole phase. You can't say unless you don't have software. But if you have software of any kind within a device, which today kind of most devices have some sort of software, the cybersecurity guidance essentially applies. And then the SBOMs is a very interesting thing. When they started with 2023, they wanted a lot more information. They have pulled it back a little bit with 2024. When they made it mandate, they pulled it back and say, okay, we'll just need what the industry standard is. So again, as I mentioned before, cybersecurity is not a healthcare specific problem. Other industries already had developed SBOM standards, and so the FDA now is basically saying, just give us whatever the SBOM information is. But essentially, you are required to keep track of all your dependencies in software. And pretty much any software, at least any software I wrote, had dependencies. I've never written software from scratch for everything. So there's always libraries you use, always things you work on, and so you got to keep track of that, and you have to have a plan on how to manage that. I think that brings the end of the content here, so we can open it up for Q&A. If you have a question, put it in the question panel, and then I'll ask as they come in. I already see a few questions that have come in, so we'll start with that. First question: are there differences between security expectations for cloud-based medical device for Europe and for the US? And can you satisfy both? I think we covered some of it, but maybe give a little bit more detailed answer.
So HIPAA versus GDPR, they are functionally equivalent laws. The GDPR has somewhat broader scope, has significantly higher fines to it, but in the end, you're trying to accomplish the same thing. You're trying to protect the privacy and security of patient data. GDPR is a little bit more nuanced in like the right to be forgotten than HIPAA is, but overall they're pretty much the same. So you know, the Galen Cloud itself, you know, through our HITRUST certification, we're certified to both. The system itself was developed to address both of those particular laws. And as I mentioned previously, you know, the MDR was actually much stricter than what the FDA required. And then with the 2023 guidance, they've really kind of caught up and become much more harmonized together, which I think was one of the overall goals from that perspective is, hey, you know, having conflicting laws does no one any good. So bringing them into some, you know, major harmony was important there.
Right. Another question that came up is, how would HITRUST, I'm assuming our HITRUST, help with hospital sales? I'm assuming if they use us or maybe just HITRUST in general.
So going into a hospital with any medical device is a multi-month generally journey. Getting your device approved by the hospital IT department can be a very long and frustrating journey. And the first part of that journey is a typically several hundred question questionnaire about your cybersecurity status. And you know, a lot of that, a big chunk of that is, of course, what security do you have on the device? Are you know, encrypting data locally? What are you storing locally? But if you have a cloud component, there's also usually many more questions than what you answer about the device itself. And where we have found our HITRUST certification to be beneficial for our customers is when they go to those hospitals and they say, well, our cloud component is HITRUST certified, those hospitals say, oh, tick a box, or there's only, you know, instead of a couple hundred questions, maybe 10 questions. It just depends on the organization, but it has significantly reduced the burden of getting through that phase. And because of that certification, just being able to be able to tick that box has been very huge when customers have been done that.
Sure. Another question, I think this is specifically for us or someone using us. It says, if you use Galen Cloud, who will do the interfacing with hospital IT? Would it be Galen or would it be us?
So, great question. It typically is a joint effort. Our customer has to initiate the conversation with the hospital IT. It's their product going in to the hospital, so they need to initiate that contact. However, we will work with our customer once that contact's been initiated to address any piece of that falls into our domain. So, you know, we believe that our customers are partners and we support them through that. So, you know, providing documentation, answering questions, participating in calls as necessary. We're happy to do that. You know, we'll handle the technical aspects of integrating with the hospital IT systems if necessary in terms of like EHR integration. We can handle that, but you know, your device itself is still your responsibility, and you know, the technical aspect around that belongs to the domain experts, which is you, the customer.
All right. A couple more questions here. Is HITRUST equivalent to SOC 2? If not, when would one get SOC 2 versus HITRUST?
So SOC 2 is part of HITRUST. In our case, the Galen Cloud runs on top of AWS. AWS themselves are HITRUST certified and SOC 2 certified. So we're able to leverage their SOC 2 compliance into our certification, and we've configured our systems running within AWS to be, compliant with all of that as well. You can get your own SOC 2 compliance outside of HITRUST. You can again inherit part of AWS's operational efficiencies out of that and do your own. But HITRUST is much more comprehensive. It's not just running the cloud services. It's running all of your operations through that. So you're making sure you have a 360-degree view of your cybersecurity. You're not just focused on one aspect of it, which is kind of what SOC 2 focuses on.
Also, HITRUST focused more on healthcare, right? So taking
Yes.
standards, industry standards, focus SOC 2 very general. In fact, SOC 2 originated from an auditing aspect of it. So it's really financial industry product to begin with. One more question here. Do you provide security documentation for FDA or CE mark submission? This assuming they're using us.
Yes. So we provide a certificate of compliance, which is a document that lists all the compliance standards that our product was developed under, our HITRUST certificate, our ISO certificate, and then any other documentation. We do have, as I mentioned, we developed the Galen Cloud as if it were a Class 3 medical device. So we have DHF information that we can provide as well when necessary to address any questions from a regulatory agency. I should also say that security is a system level, cybersecurity is a system level thing. Incorporating the Galen Cloud into your product, that's just one piece of it. The FDA has really emphasized system level security from end to end on a product through testing and documentation in the 2023 guidance. So, yes, having our part of it is important, and we're happy to provide the documentation necessary there to satisfy that. But that's not just enough for your product when you go into a regulatory approval situation. You need to make sure you're doing the entire system from end to end.
Sure. One more question. It says you mentioned FedRAMP. Why is that important? And then what is the effort to get FedRAMP certified?
So FedRAMP is the federal standard for IT systems, and that can be part of your HITRUST certification. We looked at that as part of our recertification this year, and it took our requirements from, we had 366 requirements this time around. It took it to 752, so more than double the amount of requirements in order to meet that standard. It is a significant hurdle. It's something we're evaluating for future state, but right now it's not something we are certified to, but it is something we are considering for future.
Right. One more question. Does a hospital absolutely require HITRUST, or can you get away without it?
You can try to get away without it. If you can answer all the questions in their questionnaire, and you have all those processes documented and done if you've built your own cloud, you can do that. Honestly, answering one of those questionnaires before HITRUST was almost felt like going through HITRUST. They're very detailed typically. Like, backups are you, how often are you doing backups? Are you encrypting backups? Can you provide proof that your storage, that data stored on is encrypted? What version of encryption are you using? All of that is, you're essentially not reproducing 100%, but a significant amount of work documenting to each and every hospital that, yes, I'm doing all of this, and you got to, document it in the questionnaire and sometimes provide proof. So being able to just, say, here's my HITRUST certificate, this is what it means, because in some cases hospitals haven't heard of it, and so educate them on that, and that's something we're happy to do. And they, in every case so far, has been like, oh, this is great, and well, then we don't need to worry about these questions, and and then moved on to, with the process of getting that device accepted into a hospital.
All right. One question just came in. If you were to do risk analysis with the Galen Cloud, how would the risk analysis processes be different? Not quite sure what they're asking. I'm assuming they're asking like how the process will be integrated.
The risk assessment for the overall system?
Assuming that so.
Well, I mean, you even though you have to do end-to-end cybersecurity analysis, I mean, you still have risk based on what type of data you're storing in the cloud, and the controls that we have in place through HITRUST address essentially the requirements you'd have for a class 3 medical device. As I said, we developed as if it were. So, everybody's risk analysis is just based on what you're storing and how much of it you're storing. And we've already kind of worst case that in terms of our development and the processes we have in place. So that would be a piece of it. It's just dependent on what you're doing.
I mean, it'd be fair to say that the risk analysis still has to be done. It's
Yes.
just a lot of the controls are pre-built and certified through a lot of the certification. So it's really more of the risk mitigation part is where you get the leverage.
Yes.
But there's no way around risk assessment because it's unique to each device and how it's being used and what they're doing with the device. One last question: do you have to use a third-party assessor, or can I just hire a consultant?
You could hire a consultant that is certified by HITRUST, and they have to be certified by HITRUST, and they have to be registered with HITRUST as a third-party assessor. So you can go that route. It's very expensive to become a HITRUST assessor. I know this because I went through the training myself as part of that, and it's I recommend going with a group just because there's resources. There's a lot of resources that they can provide that maybe one consultant would struggle with. Your mileage may vary, but that person, you can't just hire someone off the street who says, "Oh, I know what I'm doing." They have to be certified themselves before they can do that, and it's quite a journey getting there.
Cool. And one last question: does HITRUST only work in the U.S. or does it work internationally?
Works internationally. So like I said, our HITRUST certification covers the EU. So GDPR is one of the standards that's covered. What we found, kind of the trend internationally, is a lot of countries that didn't have privacy laws are starting to adopt laws that are very similar in structure to the GDPR, if not directly referencing the GDPR itself. As an example, Israel says if the data should be in Israel, but if you need to host the data somewhere else, it can be in the EU, and just with some documentation, that's okay. So, from our perspective, we feel like it covers international very well.
Cool. That was all the questions. Thanks, Tim. If you have any other question, the contact information is on the slide here. Reach out to us. We'll be happy to answer, or reach out to Tim directly. He's on LinkedIn and he's active there. But thanks for joining. Thanks, Tim, for taking time and educating us on the HITRUST. And then we'll see you on next month's webinar. Thank you all.